Hi, I'm Mr. Deep Sleep. I don't tell stories, I summon them. Sink into the dark and drift away. I know you want to sleep and I'm here to help you. But before then, like this video and subscribe to this channel. Have you ever walked away from someone who loved you deeply, only to wish you had stayed just a little longer? This is the story of a teenage girl who slammed the door on her father's heart when he needed her the most. It's the kind of story that stings because it's too real, one that could happen to any of us in any home, behind any closed door. He wasn't perfect, but he was all she had left. And when life got too heavy, she chose to leave. But what she didn't know was that time was running out, and her father's silence was hiding something deadly. She thought he was just being overdramatic, just a burden, just a man who didn't get her anymore. But she was wrong, terribly wrong, and life was about to teach her a lesson she would never forget. This isn't just a story about pain, it's about pride, forgiveness, and the kind of love that survives even after it's been bruised. So before you judge her and before you cry for him, listen closely, because the first sign of heartbreak sometimes comes with the sound of silence. This is she abandoned her dad when he got sick, but life taught her a lesson, and it all begins over a cold breakfast and a broken heart. Leah sat at the breakfast table scrolling through her phone, the screen lighting up her tired, defiant face. As the morning sun tried to break through the curtains her father never remembered to open. Across from her, Mark stirred his coffee with a slight tremble in his hand, eyes lingering on his daughter, as if searching for the little girl he used to tuck in at night. She didn't notice the way his fingers struggled to hold the spoon, or how the steam from his cup made him cough into his elbow, trying not to draw attention. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked gently. His voice cracked like old leather, worn down from years of trying to say the right things at the wrong times. Leah didn't lift her eyes. She shrugged with a scoff, muttering, "Fine," like the word meant absolutely nothing, and to her right now, maybe it did. The silence between them stretched longer than the table, filled with unspoken hurt, past arguments, and years of grief neither of them knew how to name. And in that silence, something fragile slipped further away, like a rope fraying at both ends, but neither of them had the strength to tie it back together. Mark cleared his throat again, trying not to sound like he was struggling to breathe, even though every breath burned more than the last. "I was thinking we could go to the park this weekend," he said, pretending this was a normal morning, pretending he wasn't falling apart from the inside out. Leah didn't answer, too busy scrolling through videos that distracted her from the dull ache of her reality, pretending she didn't hear him. He smiled anyway, a weak, hollow smile that tried to reach his eyes, but failed halfway there, like a man reaching for a hand that never reaches back. Her cereal sat untouched, soggy from minutes of being ignored, just like the questions he used to ask when she still cared to respond. There was a time not too long ago when Leah would run into the kitchen and hug him from behind, calling him her superdad. But now she barely looked at him, and he barely recognized the person he was becoming under the weight of a sickness he hadn't dared to explain. Mark reached into his pocket, fumbling with the paper he'd folded and unfolded for 3 days now. A doctor's note, a truth he couldn't yet speak aloud. He looked at Leah, wanting to tell her everything about the pain, the diagnosis, the terrifying thoughts he hadn't even said to himself yet. But instead he folded it again, too afraid of the look on her face, if she knew just how sick he really was. He remembered how she'd screamed at him last week for forgetting to pick her up after school, not knowing he'd passed out in the garage from fatigue. She had no idea, and maybe he didn't want her to. Not like this. Not when her anger still felt louder than her love. The silence became heavier, filled now with secrets, not just distance, and Mark wondered if some truths were better left unsaid, just a little longer. But time, as he would soon learn, never gives us the luxury of a little longer, especially not when it's already counting down. And somewhere down the street, in the back seat of a friend's car, Leah leaned her head against the window, frowning without knowing why. She thought about the way her dad had looked at her that morning. Not angry, not disappointed, just tired, in a way she didn't understand. She remembered the cough, that weird crackle in his voice, and how he didn't argue when she ignored him again. For a brief second she felt a strange tug in her chest, something small and guilty, that she immediately pushed away. "He's just trying to make me feel bad again," she mumbled under her breath, brushing away a feeling she didn't have the language for yet. But deep down, buried beneath her stubborn pride, a part of her knew that something wasn't right. And even though she wouldn't admit it, that part of her had already begun to fear what she might one day regret too late. He took another sip of his now lukewarm coffee, his hands shaking harder now, the strength in them no longer what it used to be. The paper in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a cruel reminder of the truth he still hadn't spoken out loud. Outside, the sound of a car engine starting signaled Leah's ride, pulling away, her life moving forward while his felt frozen in place. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the silence, but to the sound of his breath, short, shallow, fragile. He thought about the doctor's words echoing in his mind. "We caught it late. The treatment window is narrow. You need support at home." But what support did he have when the only person left in his life barely saw him anymore, when her love had turned into rebellion and silence? Still, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for healing, but for a second chance at reaching the daughter he was losing in more ways than one. Leah finally looked up, not at him, but at the kitchen clock ticking steadily toward 8 a.m., her ride to school arriving any minute. "I'm gonna be late," she muttered, grabbing her backpack with a frustrated swing, as if everything around her was keeping her trapped in a life she didn't choose. Mark opened his mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a soft, tired, "Have a good day," followed by a cough he couldn't suppress. She paused, just for a second, just long enough to hear the rasp in his voice, but she said nothing, just turned the doorknob and left. The front door closed gently. No slam, no goodbye, but the silence it left behind felt louder than any scream. Mark stared at the empty chair where she'd sat, still warm from her presence, still cold from her absence, and for the first time in weeks, he let the tears come, silent and slow, as if even they knew they had no right to interrupt the quiet. The doctor's office smelled like disinfectant and waiting, two things Mark was starting to get used to more than he wanted to admit. He sat on the cold leather chair, gripping the armrest, as if it could hold him together, while the doctor reviewed his test results one last time. His mind wandered to Leah, wondering if she was in school, wondering if she'd notice if he didn't come home tonight. The room was quiet, except for the occasional clicking of a mouse and the humming of a printer, both sounds far too normal for the news he was about to hear. Dr. Lin finally looked up with a face that didn't know how to lie, eyes filled with the kind of compassion that only comes before a storm. "Mark," she said softly, "it's stage 3. We're not too late, but it's going to be a long road, one you shouldn't walk alone." His heart didn't race, it just dropped, slow and heavy, like the moment before a ship sinks under the weight of water. It can no longer fight. The walk back to the car felt longer than the appointment itself. His legs heavier now, each step echoing with a kind of finality he hadn't felt in years. The wind blew harder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way because he was suddenly so aware of everything. Every breeze, every heartbeat, every breath. He opened the driver's side door, sat down carefully, and stared at the steering wheel, unsure if he had the energy to drive. The paper with the diagnosis sat on the passenger seat, taunting him, daring him to tell her. To be honest, before it became a goodbye, he could already hear Leah's voice in his mind. Accusations, frustration, maybe even blame, because she never liked surprises. And this was the worst kind. The car was quiet, except for his breathing, which was now just a bit too shallow, just a bit too fast, and he closed his eyes to stop himself from panicking. But deep inside, beneath the fear, was a whisper of something else. Hope, maybe, that this could be the thing to bring them back together or tear them apart forever. The mirror showed a man he barely recognized, cheeks hollowed by fatigue, eyes dimmed by fear, and a stubble he hadn't shaved in days. He splashed water on his face, as if cold water could erase terminal news or make him feel more alive than the prognosis allowed. The truth clung to him like sweat, invisible but suffocating, and no matter how much he washed, it wouldn't go away. He gripped the edges of the sink and forced himself to say the word out loud. Cancer. Just once. Just to make it real. His voice cracked, the word barely above a whisper, like it was ashamed of existing in his life at all. He knew from here on out, everything would change. His schedule, his energy, his time, and most painfully, his daughter's trust. And yet, in the hollow ache of his chest, something stirred. He needed her to know, not for pity, but because love sometimes shows up through truth, not silence. Later that evening, Leah came home, earbuds in, jacket half-zipped, and tossed her bag by the stairs like she always did. She barely glanced in his direction, eyes glued to her phone, her world more digital than personal these days. Mark sat in the recliner, a blanket around his shoulders, not just for warmth, but for the weight he could no longer carry alone. He watched her move through the house like a ghost who used to belong there, and he wondered if she saw him the same way. She opened the fridge, frowned at the lack of options, and grumbled, "There's nothing to eat," like it was his fault that grocery runs had become harder. Mark swallowed the urge to respond, to say, "I'll fix it tomorrow," even though tomorrow was beginning to feel more uncertain with each breath. Instead, he said quietly, "Leah, can we talk for a minute?" And his voice, more fragile than stern, made her pause mid-scroll. She didn't look at him yet, but her body shifted, half facing him, annoyed but curious, like she knew something was coming, but didn't want to hear it. I got some news today," he said, his words slow, spaced, careful like glass he didn't want to shatter. Leah rolled her eyes, muttering, "If it's about school again, I already told you I'm passing everything, okay?" But Mark shook his head and whispered, "No, sweetheart, it's not about school." Something in his voice pulled her eyes up finally, just long enough to see the weight he was carrying in his shoulders. He opened the folded paper and held it out to her, his hand trembling not from fear alone, but from the fear of her reaction. And in that moment, Leah did something she hadn't done in months. She put her phone down, even if just for a second. She stared at the paper in silence, the words on it blurring together as her mind raced to understand what it meant. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out, just breath, short and shaken, like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Mark watched her eyes dart across the page, the words diagnosis, chemotherapy, and fatigue, landing like gunshots in her heart. She looked at him, then really looked, and saw, maybe for the first time, how tired he actually was, how much he'd been hiding. The realization didn't come with tears, not yet, but with an uncomfortable silence, like a door creaking open between two strangers who used to be family. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, voice flat but eyes glassy, like she was afraid of the answer. Mark took a breath and said, Because I wasn't sure you'd care, and I didn't want to find out the hard way." The words hit her harder than she expected, as if guilt had been waiting behind the door of her attitude all along. She turned away, arms crossed, not to be rude, but to protect herself from the flood of emotion trying to escape. She didn't know how to process this, how to go from resentment to regret in the span of 60 seconds. But she felt something shift inside, something slow and soft and sad that she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "I didn't mean to," she started, but the sentence broke halfway, and she didn't know what came after. Mark smiled faintly, not because anything was okay, but because this moment, this broken, imperfect moment, was finally real. And sometimes, the beginning of healing doesn't come with hugs or apologies, but with silence shared between two people learning how to see each other again. Back home, the house felt colder than usual. And not because the heater was broken again, but because it echoed with absence. The photos on the wall, once full of smiles and memories, now felt like relics of a life that didn't fit anymore. He walked past the living room where Leah used to build pillow forts and fall asleep watching cartoons, long before resentment replaced bedtime stories. He stood in the hallway for a long minute, eyes resting on her closed bedroom door, his hand almost reaching for the knob before pulling away. He knew she'd be back in a few hours, stomping in like a storm, headphones in, walls up, soul guarded. Would she notice if he didn't greet her this time? Would she care if the house was quieter than usual, if the kitchen smelled less like dinner and more like grief? He turned away before the thought could finish and made his way to the bathroom, where he finally allowed himself to break silently, painfully, and alone. He nodded slowly, trying to appear strong, as if strength was something he could fake his way through this time. "Chemo?" he asked, already knowing the answer, already hearing it in his bones before it reached his ears. "Yes," she said. "Soon, and consistently. Your body's already showing signs of fatigue and organ stress." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, not a sigh of relief, but of surrender, like a soldier accepting the war was far from over. He thought of Leah again, how she rolled her eyes, how she barely said more than 2 words, how she probably hated him and didn't even know why. Dr. Lin placed a hand on his and gently added, "You'll need help, Mark, especially from family. Is there anyone at home?" He smiled faintly, eyes glassy, and whispered, "There's my daughter, but she's not really at home these days." Leah sat in her room with the door half shut, the silence louder than any fight they'd ever had, her heart pounding with thoughts she didn't know how to say. Her room, once a sanctuary of rebellion and independence, now felt like a box of gilt walls, lined with posters that no longer gave her comfort. She stared at her phone screen for minutes at a time, her thumbs hovering, wanting to text someone, anyone, but realizing she didn't know what to say. Outside her door, she could hear the TV playing softly, the sound of her father trying to pretend like the world hadn't changed in a single day. She remembered how he used to make her breakfast before school, even on days when she ignored him, even on mornings when she gave him silence instead of thanks. She thought about how many of those mornings he might have already been in pain, and how she never asked, never noticed. The shame settled in her stomach like cold stone, heavy and unrelenting, making her wonder how many chances she'd wasted before he got sick. Later that evening, Leah crept down the stairs like she was sneaking into someone else's life, unsure of how to exist in this new space between them. She found him at the dining table, the food untouched, the lights dim, and his eyes locked on the flickering TV in the corner of the room. There was something heartbreaking about seeing her father so still, so small in a room that used to feel full when they were speaking. She stood behind the chair, unsure whether to sit or keep pretending she wasn't afraid of what came next. Mark noticed her and offered a small, tired smile. one that said "I see you" without needing to say a word. She finally sat, pulling the plate toward her, and took a bite even though she wasn't hungry, just to share a moment with him again. And in that quiet dinner, filled with clinks of forks and unsaid apologies, something fragile began to grow, like a bridge built out of broken pieces. The next day, Leah skipped school for the first time in a long time. Not out of rebellion, but because she couldn't leave him alone. Not now. She didn't tell him she stayed because she was worried. She just lingered longer in the hallway, found excuses to be near him, and watched more closely. Mark pretended not to notice, even though her footsteps in the kitchen and the way she hovered during breakfast made it obvious she was watching him. He appreciated it more than she knew, but his pride was louder than his gratitude, and he wasn't ready to show weakness just yet. He still made jokes, tried to stand up straight, and insisted he could drive himself to the next appointment, even though his hands shook on the steering wheel. Leah offered to come with him casually, like it wasn't a big deal, but he looked at her too long before saying no with a soft voice. She didn't push, but in her chest, a question brewed. How do you help someone who's too proud to accept it? Over the next few days, Leah began doing small things she thought he wouldn't notice, making tea, folding laundry, charging his phone when he forgot. Mark did notice, of course, but he pretended not to, knowing that her quiet acts of kindness were her way of apologizing, healing, and beginning again. She started coming home earlier, staying off her phone longer, and even asking questions about how he was feeling. Not out of obligation, but out of care. They didn't talk about everything, they weren't ready for that. But there was less tension in the house, like the air was starting to forgive them both. Sometimes she'd find him sitting on the porch, staring out into the yard, and instead of avoiding him, she'd sit beside him and say nothing. Those silences used to feel like walls, but now they felt like doors slowly creaking open, offering space for a new kind of relationship to grow. And though the sickness didn't disappear, something else began to appear in its place. A thread of hope, faint but steady. Still, pride isn't easy to kill. And one evening Mark snapped at her when she reminded him to take his meds. It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the tone, sharp and defensive, the kind of tone that builds walls faster than forgiveness can tear them down. Leah flinched, recoiling back into her shell, hurt not because he was angry, but because she was trying and he didn't seem to see it. He saw the change in her eyes instantly, the way she shut down again, and it crushed him more than the chemo ever could. Later that night, he knocked on her door, something he hadn't done in months, and when she didn't answer, he opened it gently. She was lying in bed, eyes closed, earbuds in, but he knew she wasn't asleep, just avoiding, just retreating into the only safety she had left. "I'm sorry," he whispered, loud enough for her heart to hear, and then quietly added, "I'm just scared, Leah, that's all." And in that whisper, the walls crumbled, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for her to sit up and say, "Me too." They looked at each other, finally seeing the fear in each other's eyes, the silent desperation behind every word they hadn't spoken. He was no longer just her sick dad, and she was no longer just the rebellious daughter. Now they were two people learning to fight for each other again. She walked over and hugged him, not tightly, not for long, but long enough to remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, just the quiet return of a bond that had never really died, only gone missing for a while. And as he stood in her doorway, holding her with more strength than he thought he still had, something inside him began to heal. Because sometimes, the greatest medicine isn't found in a bottle or a hospital. It's found in the arms of the person who finally came back home. That afternoon, Mark fell asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around him, a prescription bottle half empty on the table beside him. Leah sat nearby, pretending to scroll through her phone. but her eyes kept drifting to him, studying his face, memorizing the tired lines and the way he sighed in sleep. He looked older than he had last week, maybe even older than her memories of him from just a few days ago, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. She thought of calling her aunt, someone, anyone who could help, but something stopped her. Maybe guilt, maybe the fear of others seeing how bad things had gotten. Instead, she searched online for chemo side effects, diets for recovery, and how to support a parent with cancer. Her search history now filled with things no teenager should need to know. For the first time, she wasn't angry at him anymore. Not for the rules, not for the curfews, not for the way he used to nag her about grades. She just wanted him to live, not for her sake, but because she realized she had no idea who she was without him. When he woke up, he saw her sitting there, wide awake, still as a statue, her eyes glued to the television but not really watching. He didn't say anything right away, just let the moment exist, unsure if it would scare her away or bring her closer. She turned to him slowly and asked, Do you think you're going to get better?" And her voice cracked like glass under pressure. Mark looked at her and nodded slowly, not out of certainty, but because she needed to believe in something even if he wasn't sure himself. "I'm gonna try," he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. A promise that wasn't a guarantee but held more weight than silence ever could. Leah looked away quickly, biting her lip, as if that one answer had shifted the tectonic plates beneath her walls. And in that moment, neither of them said, "I love you," but somehow it was louder than if they had. Downstairs, Mark reheated leftovers not because he was hungry, but because cooking now took more energy than he had to give. He moved slower than usual, his body aching in places it hadn't before, and his hands trembling slightly when he tried to lift the pot. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and quick dinners, had grown too quiet, too mechanical, like he was feeding himself just to survive another day. He heard Leah's footsteps above him, pacing back and forth, and wondered what she was thinking, or if she was thinking of him at all. He missed her, missed the little girl who used to dance in her pajamas, who used to beg for pancakes, who used to fall asleep on the couch beside him. But the girl upstairs now felt like a stranger wearing her face, and he wondered if the disease had stolen more than just his health. Still, he set a plate aside for her, just in case tonight was the night she chose to come downstairs, not for food, but for family. The morning of his first hospital treatment felt colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because everything around them seemed muted, like life was whispering, afraid to disturb the heaviness between father and daughter. And as Mark sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to tie his shoes with trembling hands, Leah stood silently by the doorway with her arms crossed, but her heart unraveling with each quiet second. She hadn't seen him like this before, fragile, pale, worn down by the weight of a sickness that refused to hide. And it broke something inside her that had long resisted the idea of needing anyone, especially him. He looked up and told her he didn't have to come, said he was fine, that he'd manage like always, but his voice cracked just enough for her to hear the fear hiding behind the pride. And without thinking too much, she simply replied, "I'm coming." That single sentence felt like a bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank, over years of distance and misunderstandings. And as they walked toward the car, Leah matched his steps like she used to when she was 5, watching him like he was still the strongest man in the world. The ride to the hospital was wordless but not cold, filled with quiet glances and unspoken thoughts that bounced off the windows and settled in the space between them. And Leah couldn't help but wonder how she'd ever gone so long blaming him for everything that hurt. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Mark took a deep breath and hesitated, his hand gripping the handle, as if opening that door meant surrendering everything he'd fought to hold on to. And without saying a word, Leah reached across and gently rested her hand on his, a small but powerful act that said more than any apology could. When he looked at her, surprised and shaken, she met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment something shifted. No longer father and rebel daughter, but two souls holding each other through the unknown. The hospital air smelled like bleach and anxiety, a sterile coldness that clung to skin and sank into the bones, and Leah found herself walking just half a step behind him, not out of defiance this time, but to be ready in case he stumbled. The receptionist barely looked up as Mark signed his name on a clipboard that asked too many questions with too few answers, and every pen stroke seemed to carry the weight of a man who was used to fixing problems, not becoming one. Leah studied his face, sunken eyes, pale lips, the way his shoulders drooped beneath his coat, and suddenly the memories of their last fight seemed stupid, like shadows pretending to be monsters. The nurse finally called his name, and when he stood up too quickly and wobbled, Leah's hands were already at his arm, steady and certain, her instincts no longer guarded by pride. They walked down a corridor lined with quiet suffering. People hunched in chairs, machines beeping in rhythm with hope and fear. And Mark tried to make a joke about hospitals always being too cold, but his voice shook and cracked, and it wasn't funny. Leah said nothing, just walked closer, breathing in every second, as if memorizing the feel of his presence. Every gesture now sacred in the face of what might come next. When they reached the treatment room, a nurse welcomed him with routine kindness, and Mark nodded politely, but Leah could see how tightly he was gripping the fabric of his sleeve, like a man bracing for battle he never trained for. She followed him to the chair where he would sit for hours, letting chemicals fight the invisible enemy inside him, and for the first time since her childhood, Leah wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking only of him. The nurse inserted the IV gently, but Mark winced, his jaw tightening as he stared at a fixed spot on the wall, trying not to look weak, and Leah sat beside him, studying every muscle in his face, like it was a fragile sculpture. He closed his eyes and leaned back, breathing slowly, and she could feel the war inside him, against the sickness, against the shame, against the helplessness that had no words. In that moment she reached for his hand, hesitant but resolute, expecting resistance, but instead he wrapped his fingers around hers with quiet desperation, holding on like she was the last piece of ground left under his feet. Neither of them spoke, but something was being rebuilt in the silence, something deeper than forgiveness, something like rediscovery. She watched the IV drip rhythmically, like time slowing down, and imagined all the days she'd missed being angry, being distant, while this man slowly fell apart behind closed doors. Around them, other patients sat in quiet resolve, some sleeping, some crying, all strangers bound by the same invisible thread of survival, and Leah felt herself pulled into that quiet community of warriors and their witnesses. Mark's eyes fluttered open, and for a second he looked lost, like he didn't recognize her, and it took everything in Leah not to break down in front of him. Instead, she tightened her grip and whispered, "You're not alone, Dad." And in that whisper was the weight of every word she hadn't said before, every wall she had built, finally starting to fall. Time passed like molasses in that sterile room, and Leah didn't once check her phone, didn't once think about friends, or school, or social media, because for the first time in years, her world had shrunk to this one man and this one fight. Mark drifted in and out of light sleep, his mouth slightly open, his body twitching occasionally, and each time he stirred, she whispered, "I'm here," like a chant to ward off fear. The nurse came by and asked if he needed anything, but Leah answered instead, asking for water, adjusting the blanket, doing everything she didn't know she was capable of. For years she had told herself she didn't need him, that he was the reason she was angry, but now she could see how love had simply been buried under too much pain. Every breath he took was a reminder of how fragile life really was, how pride and bitterness meant nothing, when the people we love are hurting and we're running out of chances to be there. She thought about her mum, long gone in another city, and how Mark had stayed, flawed but loyal, and suddenly she hated herself for every slammed door, every cruel word she'd ever thrown at him. As the session ended and the IV was removed, Mark looked up at her and smiled, weak, tired, but real. And in that smile, Leah saw a version of her father she hadn't seen in years, human, broken and beautiful. They walked out of the room slowly, Mark leaning on her more than he probably realized, and Leah holding his weight without complaint, without shame, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment to be more than just a daughter in name. The hallways were quieter now, the fluorescent lights dimmer, and each step echoed with a kind of gravity that told her life would never be the same again. They reached the elevator, and in the mirrored wall, Leah saw their reflection, him slouched, her upright, their hands still linked, and it struck her how roles had shifted, how the protector had become the protected. Mark tried to joke again, saying he felt like an old man, and Leah laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was brave, and sometimes bravery is all we have left to share. The drive home was slow, filled with long stretches of silence, and occasional glances that said everything words couldn't. And by the time they pulled into the driveway, Leah realized she didn't want to leave his side anymore. As he stepped out of the car, he stumbled slightly, and she was there before he even asked, her arm around him, her body a quiet wall of strength. When they got inside, he sat down with a sigh, and before he could tell her to rest, Leah disappeared into the kitchen, determined to cook for him, to serve him, to love him back for all the years he had loved her alone. The next morning, Leah woke up before the sun, not because she had anything urgent to do, but because something inside her felt unsettled, like she had entered a new reality where her father's pain had finally pierced her hardened heart. And sleep no longer came so easy. She moved quietly around the house, careful not to wake him, passing the photos she used to ignore, noticing for the first time how young he looked when he was holding her, as a baby, smiling like she was his entire world. In the living room, the coffee table was still cluttered with unpaid bills, appointment slips, and scribbled notes in her father's handwriting that seemed less firm now, more shaky, more desperate, and it made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain. She sat on the couch and opened one of the folders, expecting nothing but hospital documents, but instead found a small envelope tucked between insurance forms, labeled simply with her name in blocky, unsure letters. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, expecting anger or disappointment, but inside was a short letter written months ago where he apologized for being too broken to be the father she needed, and told her that no matter what happened, she was still his greatest reason to keep fighting. The ink was slightly smudged, and at the bottom was a faint watermark, either a coffee ring or maybe a tear, right next to the words, "If I fail, forgive me. But no, I tried." Leah read the letter 3 times before pressing it to her chest and closing her eyes, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks without permission or shame. She didn't realize she had started searching until she was already opening drawers, flipping through old notebooks, unzipping bags she hadn't touched in years, driven by a sudden hunger to know this man, not as her flawed father, but as the human being behind the silence. In the back of a closet, behind boxes of old winter clothes and unused gadgets, she found a shoebox wrapped in duct tape, heavier than it looked, and marked with the faded initials LH in black marker. Her heart pounded as she carried it to the bed, setting it down like it was a sacred thing, a time capsule of everything she had never asked him about. When she pulled back the lid, she found dozens of envelopes, all addressed to her in various forms, some with nicknames, others with "To my daughter" in nervous handwriting, all unopened, unsent, hidden like forgotten love songs waiting for someone to listen. Each one was dated, spanning years she thought he didn't care, her 13th birthday, the week she won her art competition, The night she ran away for 2 days and never told him where she went. And in every letter, he poured his soul out in ways he never did in person. He apologized when he didn't understand her, celebrated her even when she pushed him away, and begged her not to lose herself in anger, just because he didn't know how to show his pain. Leah sat cross-legged on the floor, reading through page after page, feeling her father's voice reach across time and speak directly to the girl who had refused to hear him for so long. And as she read, the edges of her resentment softened into grief, then melted into something even deeper: regret, love, and an aching desire to start again. By the time Mark woke up and shuffled into the hallway with his robe loosely tied and a confused look on his face, Leah was still on the floor, surrounded by letters and tear-streaked memories, her arms hugging one of the envelopes like a child with a forgotten toy. He looked down at her and froze, uncertain whether to ask or pretend he didn't see the box he'd kept hidden all these years. But Leah looked up at him with eyes that no longer carried anger, only raw emotion. "Why didn't you ever give them to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing his face before sitting beside her on the carpet, his body still weak, but his presence suddenly heavier with unspoken weight. He said he was afraid that she wouldn't care, that the words wouldn't mean anything, that maybe keeping them safe was easier than having them rejected like he had been. Leah didn't interrupt, didn't argue, because for once she understood how hard it was to speak when you didn't know how to be heard. He told her he wrote when he didn't know what else to do, when she slammed doors, when she skipped school, when he found out about the pills in her drawer, and every letter was his way of staying close, even when she pushed him away. She didn't say much, just reached out and rested her head on his shoulder like she hadn't done since she was little, and for a long time they sat in that silence, letting the ghosts of the past breathe and fade together. That night, Leah couldn't sleep, her mind replaying every letter, every line, every missed moment that could have changed everything if she had only known, and the weight of it kept her awake like a heavy storm that had finally arrived after years of build-up. She stared at the ceiling, wondering how many times he had sat in the next room, writing words he'd never send, while she screamed that he didn't care or disappeared without explanation. The thought haunted her, not in a way that crushed her, but in a way that opened her up, like a wound finally healing the right way from the inside out. She walked into his room quietly, just to check on him, and found him asleep with the lamp still on, his breathing shallow but peaceful, the letter she had returned to him earlier resting gently on his chest. Leah stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding back tears, then walked over, turned off the light, and kissed his forehead, whispering, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." As she pulled the blanket over him and tiptoed out, she realized she had been the one who needed saving all along. Not from him, but from herself. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Not perfect, but real. And that was more than enough. The next morning, she made breakfast for both of them, and when Mark looked surprised, she just smiled and said, "It's my turn now." Leah didn't know how to act around him the next day, and part of her hated that everything now felt delicate, like glass you couldn't drop, but didn't know how to carry without cutting yourself. She cleaned the living room without being asked, reheated his tea when it got cold, and even offered to drive him to his next appointment, though the silence in the car made her feel like a stranger in her own life. She kept looking at his hands, how they trembled slightly when he reached for the gear stick, how thin his wrists looked beneath his worn sweater, how he winced every time he coughed and tried to hide it, like it was some kind of shame. And while he didn't say much, his eyes flickered with something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but quiet hope, like he noticed the shift too, and didn't want to scare it away. They sat in the waiting room surrounded by other patients, some hooked up to IV, others staring blankly at the floor, And for the first time, Leah realized how lonely he must have been during all those visits. Fighting silently, surrounded by strangers, while she was out somewhere blaming him for everything. She reached over and touched his hand, and he looked at her like it was the first time in years she'd chosen to see him as something more than just a mistake in her life. That moment didn't fix everything between them, but it cracked open a door that had been closed for too long. And sometimes that's all it takes to start letting the light back in. Back at home, Leah sat on her bed with the letters piled around her like snowdrifts of forgotten love, unable to stop reading them even though each one broke her heart a little more. In one letter, he wrote about how scared he was the night she didn't come home, how he stayed up walking the streets, afraid someone had hurt her, afraid he'd never see her again. And when she finally came back without explanation, he didn't yell, not because he wasn't angry, but because he was just too relieved. Another letter talked about the day her mother left, and how he didn't know how to raise a daughter alone, how he faked strength every day just so she wouldn't see how lost he really was. There were letters from birthdays he missed because of work, cards he never gave her after arguments, and even a list of her favorite things that he kept updated through the years. Lilac-scented lotion, grilled cheese with tomato soup, and the way her voice sounds when she says, "You don't get it." Leah laughed through her tears, realizing he had paid attention even when she thought he wasn't there, even when she screamed that he didn't care. There was a letter where he apologized for being too tired to come to her school play, even though he'd already been at work for 16 hours straight that week, and how he cried in his car that night, knowing she didn't see him clapping from the back. And suddenly, she realized all the moments she thought he had abandoned her were actually moments he was sacrificing more than she ever knew, in silence, in shame, in unconditional love. She couldn't stop thinking about how pride had kept them apart for so long, hers and his, like two opposing mirrors that only reflected pain and never truth. And now that the truth was in front of her, sprawled across paper and ink and broken years, she didn't know what to do with all the guilt rising in her chest. Like a wave too big to hold, she had spent so much time waiting for him to prove he cared that she never once considered he already had. In every missed meal, every second shift, every word he swallowed so he wouldn't make things worse. Leah stood in the hallway that night, holding one of the letters close to her heart, listening to the slow hum of the heater and her father coughing softly in the next room, and she wondered how much time they had left to get it right. The thought terrified her, not in a dramatic movie kind of way, but in a quiet, real kind of fear. The kind that grips you when you realize second chances aren't promised, only offered, and you have to be brave enough to take them. She knocked gently on his door, and when he called out, she pushed it open and sat beside him without saying a word, handing him one of the letters and whispering, "You didn't have to say all this on paper. You could have just told me." And Mark looked at her, eyes glossy, voice raw, and said, "I didn't know how, but I hoped one day you'd read them anyway." That night, Leah stayed in the room long after he fell asleep, watching him breathe, watching the rise and fall of a man who had never stopped loving her, even when she made it impossible. The moonlight spilled through the window in soft slants, casting shadows across his tired face, and illuminating the fine lines around his mouth, the kind carved by years of silent sacrifice and heartbreak. She thought of all the times she had shouted that he didn't care, all the times she slammed doors and refused to speak, not knowing he was crying behind his own, writing instead of reacting, choosing patience over pain. The realization shook her deeply, undoing years of bitterness in a single night, replacing resentment with something far more powerful, remorse mingled with awakening. She ran her hand gently over the blankets, whispering apologies she couldn't say aloud yet, promising herself that she would make the time they had left matter, no matter how much or how little it turned out to be. And in that stillness, something shifted, not just in her but in the space between them, like forgiveness had started to grow, slow and fragile but alive. And for the first time in years, Leah felt like she was home, not in the house, not even in the moment, but in the truth of being her father's daughter. Leah couldn't sleep after reading those letters. Something inside her had shifted like a broken bone snapping back into place. Painful but necessary, and she couldn't ignore it anymore even if she tried. She wandered through the hallway barefoot, letting her fingertips graze the family photos on the wall, seeing them now not just as memories, but as proof that somewhere in the middle of their broken story, love had always been there. The house felt smaller than she remembered, as if the walls themselves had sagged under the weight of the years, and suddenly she noticed things she had ignored before. The frayed couch, the old TV, the same chipped coffee table from her childhood. She wandered into the storage room and started opening boxes, curious to see what her father had kept all these years, wondering if there were more letters or forgotten keepsakes buried in the dust. Instead, she found receipts, pawn slips, and a journal, things he never meant her to see, things that told the story behind the story, the sacrifices that didn't come with applause. There was a receipt for her first guitar, one she never asked for but played for hours, and right beneath it a pawn slip for his old camera, the one he used to love, the one he stopped carrying when times got hard. And for the first time, Leah realized he hadn't just given her things, he had given up his own dreams so she could chase hers. Each slip of paper was like a confession from the past, a whisper of what he gave up when she wasn't looking, a sacrifice made quietly and without complaint. She found another receipt tucked between the pages of the journal. It was for her college application fees, and beneath it, a folded letter he never sent, saying he sold his wedding ring to pay them because her future meant more to him than a piece of gold. Her throat tightened as she read his words. If she never knows, that's okay. Fathers aren't meant to be heroes, they're meant to be foundations. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stop the sob that was building, not just from grief, but from the crushing realization that while she was rebelling, escaping, blaming, he was holding everything together with hands that were bleeding. There were more slips, more pawn tickets, his watch, his bike, even the guitar her mother gave him before she left. All gone, all traded for moments she barely remembered. She had always thought he was careless with money, angry about everything, but now she saw the truth. He was simply tired from always choosing her over himself. And suddenly, all the moments she had once used to define him as selfish now looked like acts of love she hadn't yet grown wise enough to see. She carried the box into the living room and sat on the couch, setting each item down like relics on an altar, her heart cracking wider with every forgotten piece of her father's sacrifice. When he shuffled out in the morning, weak but curious, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Why didn't you ever tell me what you gave up?" He sat beside her, staring at the slips, his face unreadable, his hands folded in his lap, like a man preparing to confess without words. After a long silence, he said softly, "Because love isn't loud, Leah. Sometimes it's just doing what needs to be done, and hoping they'll understand one day." That sentence hit her harder than any lecture, any punishment, any moment they had screamed at each other across slammed doors. She looked at the slips again, seeing them now as letters he wrote, with his life instead of his hands, and she wanted to ask so many things, but all she could say was, "I didn't know." He nodded gently and replied, "You weren't supposed to. You were just supposed to live better. Because of..." And in that moment, she finally understood what being a parent meant. It wasn't just providing, it was bleeding quietly, while someone else ran free. Later that day, Leah drove to the pawn shop, listed on one of the receipts, unsure of what she was looking for, but desperate to bring back even one thing he'd lost for her. The shop was dusty and cramped, filled with forgotten treasures and stories no one cared to remember, but she searched with the patience of someone trying to piece a soul back together. She found his camera, scratched and older now, resting beneath a glass counter like an old friend, waiting to be found. And when she held it in her hands, she could almost see him again, young, passionate, hopeful. She bought it with her own savings and brought it home, placing it on the table in front of him without a word. And the way his eyes lit up made her heart ache with something she hadn't felt in years: pride. He reached out and ran his fingers over the lens, like it was something sacred, tears pooling in his tired eyes. And when he looked at her, he simply said, "You remembered." Leah nodded, too choked up to speak, and sat beside him, her hand resting over his like a silent promise. She couldn't fix the past, but she could finally start showing up for the present, and maybe that was enough. That night, she found his old journal again, and kept reading, pages filled with worry, with silent prayers, with lines like, "I don't know how to be both her father and her shield, but I'll try anyway." She realized he had lived his entire life balancing love and fear. Love for her, and fear that it wouldn't be enough, that he was failing her no matter how hard he tried. And she had spent years judging him by his failures, blind to the quiet triumphs that kept their lives together, blind to the daily sacrifices that weren't loud enough to notice. It hurt to admit, but it also healed something deep inside her, something that had been angry for too long without reason. She closed the journal, wiped her tears, and whispered to the air, "I see you now, Dad. I'm sorry it took me this long." In the dim glow of the living room, she heard his breath steadying in the other room, not from healing but from peace, because sometimes being seen is the first step to being forgiven. And forgiveness, she was starting to learn, is less about forgetting the pain and more about finally understanding where it came from. Leah sat by the window the next morning, watching the pale sunlight crawl across the floor, and she wondered how many mornings her father had sat like this, waiting for her to come back home but never daring to ask. The silence between them had softened since the night of discovery, like old wounds learning how to breathe without hurting. But the words she wanted to hear most, "I'm sorry," still hadn't come from his lips. She had always imagined that healing would come with an apology, that forgiveness would be unlocked by the simple admission of guilt. But now she wasn't so sure. Every time she looked at him, thinner, older, quieter, she realized he was already saying sorry in 1,000 other ways, through gestures too small to see until you looked with the eyes of someone who finally understood. Still, a part of her ached for it, that final, spoken surrender of pride, as if hearing it would validate all the pain she once carried like armor. She watched him struggle with his pills, refusing help, grumbling under his breath about being fine, and she almost smiled, because even sick he was still stubborn, still her dad. And maybe that was the hardest part, accepting that some people show love through resistance, and apologies might come in actions, not words. They started talking more, not deeply, not yet, but in small exchanges over tea, over news reports, over half-laughed memories that didn't hurt so much anymore. Leah found herself listening to him instead of reacting, hearing the layers beneath his tone, the loneliness tucked into every sarcastic remark, the hope behind every reluctant smile. He asked about her job, her music, the friends he had never met, and she realized how much he wanted to know but never pushed, because she had always made it clear she didn't want to share. Now sitting at the table together, she could feel the years between them folding into something gentler, something almost sacred, as if they both understood that time was no longer a luxury they could waste. Still, every time he coughed too hard or took too long to answer, fear twisted in her stomach, fear that this second chance might be too late, that all the words they hadn't said would go with him if he didn't survive this fight. But even as that fear grew, she found herself choosing presence over panic, love over blame, sitting beside him in silence, just to let him know she was there. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't about fixing, it's just about showing up and staying. One night, Leah found herself cooking his favorite meal, the way her mother used to before she left. And as the smell filled the kitchen, she heard him shuffle in and pause at the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his robe pockets, looking at her like she was someone new and someone old at the same time. "Smells like a memory," he finally said, and she looked up, unsure whether to laugh or cry. So she did both, right there over the stove. He sat down slowly, watching her move, and when she placed the plate in front of him, she felt the weight of every moment she had taken him for granted settle softly between them. They ate in silence, but it was the kind that spoke volumes, the kind that said, "I remember, I forgive you, I love you," all at once. After the dishes were done, she sat across from him, her hands clasped nervously, and said, "I used to wish you'd just say sorry for everything." He looked at her then, his eyes clouded with age and something deeper, shame, maybe, and he replied, "I used to wish you'd say the same." That sentence hung in the air like a bridge being built between two cliffs, shaky but finally reaching. Leah sat on the edge of the bed with the letter trembling in her hands, her breath shallow as if the truth it held was too heavy to inhale all at once, and her fingers traced the faded ink, like it could somehow soften the blow of what she had just read. The letter wasn't written with blame or bitterness. It was a goodbye, penned by her mother not in anger, but in heartbreak, explaining that she had given her father a choice between continuing his sacrifice for someone else or saving what was left of their family. "She needed you more than we did," the letter read, and Leah's throat tightened as she realized it wasn't about money or even abandonment. It was about someone named Eleanor, someone her father had been caring for in secret while trying to keep everything else from falling apart. Each line peeled back another layer of the man she thought she had figured out, revealing a kind of love that was messy, painful, selfless, and completely misunderstood by everyone around him, including her. She stormed into the living room, the letter clutched like a weapon of truth, and he looked up from his recliner with eyes that had already accepted the storm, like he knew it would find him eventually. "Who is Eleanor?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a blend of betrayal and sorrow. And he didn't flinch, didn't lie, just closed his eyes for a long moment before saying softly, "My sister, your aunt, the one no one talks about, because she never left the hospital bed she was born into." Leah froze, her mind racing to make sense of this ghost from the past, and he continued, "Your mum said we couldn't keep giving everything to her, that it was time to let go, but I couldn't, Leah. She had no one else. She still does." And in that instant, the anger that had burned in her chest began to flicker, replaced by something even heavier, understanding. Her father had been fighting on too many fronts, and somewhere in that war they had all lost something, but not because he stopped loving them, because he didn't know how to stop loving anyone. He explained how every spare cent, every hidden trip, every unexplained absence was tied to a hospital room 2 cities away, where a woman who never spoke and barely moved still received fresh flowers and a quiet promise from a brother who refused to abandon her. "I thought if I could save her," he said, voice cracking under the weight of years, "then maybe I could save what was left of us too." Leah listened with her arms folded, but her heart open, hearing the strain behind his silence, and finally grasping the impossible choices that shaped their lives. It wasn't that he loved Eleanor more, it was that he never believed in letting go, and that stubbornness, the same trait that once drove her away, now painted him in a completely different light. The man she thought had chosen everything over her was actually breaking inside, trying to hold everyone together with hands that had long since started to fail him. And for the first time, Leah didn't feel like a victim of his pride. She felt like the daughter of a man who never stopped trying, even when everything fell apart. She spent the next few days in a quiet fog, not knowing how to feel, what to say, or how to navigate this new story she had just inherited. And every time she passed him in the hallway, he looked at her with eyes full of guilt and love and exhaustion, She began to research Eleanor on her own, visiting the hospital unannounced, and standing outside the sterile room with trembling knees and a racing heart, afraid of what she might see. What she found wasn't tragic. It was peaceful in a way that hurt more than it healed, because it meant her father had kept his promise, even when no one else was watching. The nurses knew him by name, referred to him with soft smiles and stories of how he came every week with music recordings, how he read to Eleanor as if she could hear, how he believed in her presence even when others stopped. Leah left the hospital that day with tears she didn't know she had, walking slowly back to the car with a question echoing in her soul. Would I have made the same choice? That night, she sat beside her father, neither of them speaking for a long time, the air thick with the weight of everything now said and unsaid, and finally she whispered, "I didn't know." He didn't answer immediately, just looked at her with eyes that held both relief and sadness, and after a moment he replied, "You weren't supposed to, because I wanted to protect you from having to carry the same burdens I did." That hit her harder than anything else, because all this time she thought he had left her behind, when in truth, he had been shielding her the only way he knew how. They didn't talk about forgiveness, or apologies, or guilt. They just sat there, side by side, two people finally beginning to understand the weight each had carried in silence. Leah leaned her head on his shoulder, not to comfort him, but because she needed the connection just as much as he did. And in that small, quiet moment, a bridge rebuilt itself, not from blame or confession, but from truth, raw and uncomfortable, and healing all at once. Because sometimes, understanding is louder than forgiveness, and love stronger than pain. Leah began showing up at the hospital every Sunday, sometimes with flowers, sometimes just with her presence, unsure of what she was looking for but driven by something stronger than guilt, something closer to redemption. The nurses started recognizing her, calling her by name, and she began learning about Eleanor not just through medical charts, but through the small things, her favorite scent, the way she reacted to violin music, the rare flutter of her eyelids when someone read from a certain poetry book. It became clear that her father hadn't just visited Eleanor out of obligation. He had kept her spirit alive in small, consistent ways that no one else ever would have thought to do. And Leah, who had once seen him as cold and distant, now saw a man who had loved so deeply he forgot to explain himself, who believed in loyalty over comfort and sacrifice over understanding. She began journaling her visits, writing letters to Eleanor even though there were no answers, just to feel like she could add something to the years of silence her father had filled with hope. Somewhere in those moments, Leah stopped being angry and started becoming something more, someone who saw her father not as broken, but as quietly heroic. And as she walked out of the hospital on her 5th visit, she realized forgiveness wasn't something you gave with words, it was something you proved with action. Back at home, her father began to change too, as if the return of his daughter had lit a small fire in him he thought had gone cold, and he started smiling again, softly, cautiously, like a man relearning how to be happy. He began telling stories from the past that had once been locked away, about how Leah used to cling to his leg when she was 5, or how she used to demand bedtime stories from both him and her mum even if she was half asleep. They cooked together for the first time in years, fumbling through recipes and laughing over burnt toast and undercooked rice, and Leah realized how much of their relationship had been buried beneath years of silence and misunderstanding. She started seeing him less as the man who failed to protect her from life's messiness, and more as someone who had never stopped protecting everyone the only way he knew how. Every now and then they'd sit quietly on the porch, no words spoken, just the soft rhythm of shared peace and a mutual promise not to run from each other again. Leah didn't forget the pain, she just stopped letting it be the only story she told herself. And in that stillness, in those slow and gentle reconnections, something beautiful began to rebuild between them. Then came the unexpected. The hospital called one morning to say Eleanor had taken a turn for the worse, and her vitals were dropping after years of stable stillness, and they should come soon if they wanted to say goodbye. Leah watched her father freeze in place, the coffee mug trembling in his hands, and then without a word, he grabbed his coat and reached for the car keys like muscle memory, guided him more than thought. She followed him without asking, climbing into the passenger seat and clutching her own hands tightly, unsure of what she could offer in a moment like this, but knowing she needed to be there. The drive was silent, but heavy with years of unspoken grief, and when they arrived, the nurses greeted them like family, their faces solemn but kind. In that dimly lit hospital room, Leah watched her father kneel by Eleanor's bed and whisper something so gentle and broken that she couldn't hear it, but she felt it like thunder in her chest. She stood beside him, not as a bystander anymore, but as a daughter who finally understood that this was not weakness, it was love in its purest, most painful form. And when Eleanor finally passed later that evening, it wasn't just the end of a life, it was the closing of a chapter that had shaped their family's pain, and now, possibly their healing. They left the hospital hand in hand, the silence between them no longer awkward but sacred, and as they stepped into the night, Leah realized the world felt a little different. Emptier, yes, but somehow clearer. The sky stretched above them like a quiet witness to their grief, and for the first time in her life, Leah didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she was walking toward it. She turned to her father and whispered. She knew you loved her, and the way he squeezed her hand told her that was the only thing he had needed to hear. They didn't talk much on the drive home, but the silence was warm now, no longer cold or angry. It was filled with mutual respect and a kind of peace that only comes when the truth finally has room to breathe. That night, Leah couldn't sleep, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that life was far more complicated than she had allowed it to be. And her father had been navigating storms she never saw. She sat at her desk, opened her journal, and began to write, not just about Eleanor, but about her father, his flaws, his heart, his sacrifices, his unwavering love. And in those pages, she finally began to see him, not as the man who abandoned her, but as the man who never stopped fighting for the people he loved, no matter how much it cost him. The next morning, Leah made breakfast and brought it to his room. Pancakes, slightly burnt, with syrup dripping unevenly, and orange juice that was too pulpy, but he smiled like it was a 5-star meal. You didn't have to, he said, surprised, and she just shrugged, trying to play it cool, but the truth was, she wanted to do it, wanted to give back even a small piece of what he had given all his life. They ate in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging glances that said more than words could, and she noticed the way his eyes were a little less tired, like the weight on his chest had lifted just enough to let him breathe again. Afterward, he showed her a box of old photos, Eleanor as a baby, their mum smiling in the kitchen, a younger version of himself laughing with a baby Leah on his shoulders, and they laughed and cried until the lines between past and present blurred into something bittersweet and honest. It was a new beginning, not built on pretending the pain hadn't happened, but on accepting that love was sometimes messy, sometimes flawed, but still worth choosing over and over again. As the sun rose higher, Leah felt something inside her shift, a deep, resounding sense of gratitude that she had been given the chance to understand before it was too late. And in that quiet morning light, she realized the real lesson wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about seeing, truly seeing, the people who love us, even when we don't understand the way they show it. Leah began keeping a journal, not the kind filled with daily entries or schedules, but one for thoughts she didn't yet have the courage to say aloud, especially the ones about how love had changed shape for her. She wrote about the guilt that still whispered when she saw her father's tired hands, and the gratitude that surged every time he smiled at her like she was a gift and not a burden. Sometimes she left the journal open on the table, and she wondered if he ever read the pages, because some mornings she'd find a cup of tea beside it and a fresh flower from his garden placed on top. Those silent exchanges meant more than any apology could, and slowly they built a bridge stronger than all the years that had nearly torn them apart. Leah found herself more patient, more grounded, and more forgiving, not just with her father, but with herself. And that was perhaps the hardest part of all. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a single act. It was a habit, a choice made over and over again, until it stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like freedom. And in that freedom, she discovered not who she had been, but who she was becoming. A woman no longer defined by anger or abandonment, but by courage and compassion. One Sunday afternoon, while cleaning out a dusty drawer in the hallway, Leah found something she'd never seen before. A necklace, tarnished but beautiful, with a tiny locket and her name etched faintly on the back. Inside was a photo of her as a baby, cradled in her mother's arms, and behind it a folded note that read, "For Leah, when she's ready to understand how deeply she's always been loved." She clutched it to her chest, tears falling silently, and rushed downstairs to show her father, who looked at it for a long time before whispering, "She bought that the day you were born. Said you'd need it one day more than anything else." It was in that moment Leah knew, no matter how broken things had seemed, love had always been present, waiting to be rediscovered, like a hidden treasure buried beneath years of silence and sorrow. She wore the necklace every day after that, not as decoration, but as armor, as memory, as a quiet vow to never again take love for granted. And with each passing day, she let it guide her decisions, how she spoke, how she forgave, how she lived. Because now, every part of her life whispered one truth, louder than anything else. Love doesn't vanish when people do. It waits patiently for you to come back home. As summer faded into autumn, Leah and her father stood together on the porch one evening, watching the sky melt into 1,000 shades of orange, gold, and quiet. They didn't say much, because some peace doesn't need to be spoken. It's felt in the stillness between heartbeats, and in the simple joy of not being alone anymore. He handed her a mug of tea, the way he always did, and she took it with both hands, holding it like it was sacred, because in some ways it was. "Thank you for coming back," he said softly, his voice trembling with all the things he never got to say before, and she replied just as softly, "Thank you for waiting." And in that exchange, father and daughter found something they thought had been lost forever. Home, not just in the house, but in each other. They stood there for a long time, not needing anything more than the quiet reminder that healing is possible, even after the worst storm. And as the sun disappeared behind the trees, Leah closed her eyes and whispered into the dusk, "This time I'm staying." Leah sat by her bedroom window that evening, watching the wind rustle through the trees like whispers, carrying stories that never reached their destination. And she held a letter she had written months ago, sealed but never mailed. It was addressed to her mother, the woman whose absence had left 1,000 unanswered questions in her heart, and a silence between her and her father that took years to mend. In that letter were words soaked in anger, confusion, longing, and all the sharp edges of a daughter left behind to figure out what love meant when one parent left and the other suffered. She had written it on a night when the house felt too heavy, when her father's cough echoed down the hall and her own guilt felt louder than her heartbeat. But now, holding the envelope again, something in her felt different, as if time had softened the words that once burned on paper. She didn't know if her mother would ever read it, or if she even deserved to. But she knew the girl who wrote it needed to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, letting it go would teach her something that holding on never could. She walked into the kitchen, where her father sat quietly with his crossword puzzle, the same one he always did on Sundays, and she placed the letter on the table between them without saying a word. He looked at it, recognizing her handwriting, but didn't touch it, just raised his eyes to meet hers with a gentleness that said he understood more than she ever had to explain. "Do you want to send it?" he asked, softly, and she shook her head slowly, eyes misted with the weight of everything she wasn't sure she needed anymore. "I just wanted you to know I wrote it," she whispered, "because there were things I didn't know how to say back then." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his grip rough but warm, a father's grip forged from years of pain and silent sacrifice. "You don't owe her anything," he said, not with bitterness, but with the quiet strength of a man who had chosen love even when it wasn't returned. "But I'm proud of you for wanting to heal, even if it hurts." Later that night, Leah sat on the porch with her father's old record player, humming in the background, and she remembered how her mother used to dance barefoot in the kitchen before everything fell apart. The memory no longer stung like it used to. Instead, it floated into her like a breeze carrying the scent of something long forgotten, but still beautiful. She let herself smile, just a little, because memories weren't always meant to be prisons. Sometimes they were bridges to understanding what once was. She didn't need to know all the reasons why her mother left anymore. What mattered now was who had stayed, who had fought, and who had chosen love over pride. That realization wrapped itself around her like a blanket, and for the first time in years, she felt peace where resentment used to live. Maybe the letter wasn't meant to reach her mother after all. Maybe it was meant to free the girl who wrote it. And as the stars blinked awake in the sky, Leah whispered a quiet goodbye to the pain she had carried for too long. The next morning, Leah tucked the letter back into her journal and scribbled beside it, "Some words are meant for release, not revenge." Her father peeked through the door and said breakfast was ready, and she followed him into the kitchen, the warmth of the stove and the smell of eggs grounding her in the comfort of now. They talked about small things, the weather, a neighbor's new dog, the best way to make crispy toast, and somehow, those small things felt like the biggest miracles. She was learning to love the ordinary again, to see magic in the mundane, and it felt like discovering a new world inside the same old house. Her father told a bad joke, the kind that used to make her roll her eyes, but this time she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it reminded her they were healing. The air between them had shifted. It was no longer filled with regret, but with quiet gratitude and mutual respect. And in that kitchen, between burnt toast and morning light, a new kind of love was being written, one that needed no apology. That weekend, Leah went to visit her childhood best friend, someone she hadn't seen in over a year because life had gotten in the way, and shame had made her disappear from everyone. They sat under a tree in the park, where they used to play, and Leah told her everything, not for pity, but because silence no longer served her healing. Her friend listened without judgment, holding her hand when words failed, and laughing softly at the strange, beautiful ways life turns us into people we never expected to become. Leah admitted she had hated her father once, had run away not just physically, but emotionally, leaving him to face his illness alone while she tried to outrun her own reflection. But something had changed, and now she saw him for who he truly was, a man who loved her the only way he knew how, by staying. Her friend smiled and said, "Sometimes we have to leave to know where we belong," and those words stayed with Leah for days, because belonging, she realized, had nothing to do with place, and everything to do with the people who refuse to give up on you, even when you've given up on yourself. That night, as Leah stood brushing her teeth, she looked in the mirror and saw someone new staring back. Not the angry teenager who slammed doors, but a young woman with eyes full of stories and a heart learning how to forgive. She wondered what her mother would think if she could see her now, if she'd recognize the strength in the daughter she once left behind. But she didn't dwell on it, because the answers to those questions no longer defined her worth. She wiped the mirror clean with a cloth, watching her reflection become sharper, clearer, as if the fog of the past was finally lifting. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it, because she had her father, her courage, and the truth of who she was becoming, and that was more than enough. The letter remained in her journal, untouched but no longer aching, just a quiet reminder of a pain that had served its purpose, and a story that no longer controlled her. One evening, her father asked if she'd ever write a new letter, one not to the past, but to her future self. And she smiled, saying maybe she already was, every day, in the way she chose to live. Together they began new routines, planting herbs in the backyard, watching old films on Sundays, trying new recipes, and laughing when they failed horribly. These rituals, though simple, began stitching a tapestry of connection that didn't need grand gestures, just presence, effort, and time. Leah still had hard days, moments where shadows from the past tried to creep in, but now she had the tools to face them, and the love to soften their sting. Her father, still not fully recovered, leaned on her as much as she leaned on him, and somehow that balance brought them closer than they'd ever been. And so the house they once haunted with their silence became a home again. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had finally chosen each other. One afternoon, Leah picked up the letter again and lit a candle beside it, not to destroy it, but to honor it, a symbol of the girl she used to be, and the healing she had chosen. She placed it in a keepsake box with a note that read, "For the journey, not the destination," and tucked it under her bed where it no longer haunted her. Her father knocked on the door and peeked in, asking if she was ready for dinner, and she nodded with a smile that came easier now. As they ate, she looked at him and realized that despite everything they'd been through, love had never really left. It had only gotten buried under layers of pain, waiting to be unearthed. And now, it was blooming again, in simple ways. A shared meal, a quiet laugh, a letter that no longer needed to be sent. The past was still there, but it no longer held the power to control her. She had taken that power back by choosing love over pride, presence over escape. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, Leah knew healing doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. Leah began journaling more often, not because she was trying to escape, but because she was finally ready to remember and reflect, even on the parts that hurt. Her pages were no longer filled with rage or blame, but with gratitude for growth and clarity that pain had slowly given her. One morning, she wrote about the way her father hummed to himself while making tea, a habit she used to find annoying, but now found oddly comforting. She wrote about the way the air felt different when she no longer carried resentment in her chest, how even silence between them was no longer cold but quietly healing. Her writing became a mirror, not of who she had been but who she was becoming, a daughter, learning to see her father not as the man who failed, but the man who endured. And in those pages, she found parts of herself she didn't know were missing. Fragments of courage and softness that had always been there, buried beneath years of pain. Every paragraph she wrote was like an apology to herself, an embrace of the girl who didn't know how to love without running. One Sunday evening, as the sky turned golden and the world felt suspended in quiet peace, Leah sat on the porch beside her father, each of them sipping tea in content silence. She looked over at him and realized how much older he seemed, not just from illness, but from years of shouldering burdens alone while trying to keep them both afloat. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," she said out loud for the first time, her voice shaking with the weight of truth, and her father turned to her, his eyes soft but tired. "You came back," he replied simply, like those 3 words undid every ache he never asked her to carry. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. Because sometimes forgiveness wasn't a grand moment, but a quiet one, whispered between breaths and memories. They didn't need to say more, because some love didn't need explanations, only time and the willingness to stay when it mattered. In that moment, Leah understood something powerful. Redemption doesn't always come through a dramatic act, but through everyday choices to be better, to show up, and to keep loving anyway. As the days passed, Leah began helping more around the house, not out of guilt, but out of love. A quiet way of saying thank you to the man who once carried her through storms without asking for anything in return. She learned his medication schedule, reminded him to rest, and even drove him to his checkups, no longer avoiding the harsh truth of his fragility. They started reading books together again, like they used to when she was little, only now the stories they shared were laced with the unspoken truth that time was not infinite. But instead of drowning in that thought, Leah found herself holding on to the present tighter, smiling at every shared laugh, savoring every moment like a rare treasure. Her friends noticed the change in her, how her voice had softened, how her eyes no longer looked like they were trying to escape. And when they asked what happened, she simply said, "Life taught me who really shows up when it counts." Because some lessons didn't need to be shouted. They were lived, learned in the quiet act of returning home. One rainy afternoon, Leah found an old photo of her parents dancing barefoot in the living room, arms tangled in love and laughter. And something in her heart cracked open, not from pain, but from understanding. She brought it downstairs, handed it to her father, and watched as his face lit up like he was staring into a memory too sacred for words. "She used to make me dance even when I said no," he laughed, voice catching with emotion. "She said music could fix any mood." Leah stood silently, imagining what their love must have been like before illness turned it into duty, before silence swallowed joy, before promises became cages. And in that moment, she vowed that if she ever found love like that, she would choose it openly, fearlessly, not with sacrifice, but with balance. Her father turned to her and said, "You remind me of her. You know, stubborn, bright, and too big for this town." And for the first time, Leah didn't shy away from the comparison. She accepted it like a torch passed down. They danced that night in the living room, just like the photo, with music crackling from an old radio, and no one watching but the ghosts that now smiled, no longer haunting but blessing. It wasn't about pretending everything was okay. It was about deciding to live anyway. One evening, Leah caught her father on the phone with an old friend, a woman she vaguely remembered from church, someone her dad had once refused to have dinner with out of guilt, and her heart skipped. She listened from the kitchen as he stumbled through small talk, his voice nervous, unsure, but filled with hope in a way that made her smile and cry all at once. Later, when he admitted it to her, red-faced and sheepish, Leah simply hugged him and said, "You deserve to be happy too, Dad." And he didn't respond, but she felt his breath hitch, as if he'd waited years to hear those words. The next week, he shaved clean for the first time in months, wore a pressed shirt, and left the house, not as a father or caregiver, but as a man chasing his own second chance. And Leah, instead of feeling abandoned or left behind, felt proud, because the man she had hated for being too strong, too cold, was now strong enough to begin again. They talked more after that, about dreams, about regrets, about life beyond survival. And Leah realized something most people never do. Healing doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to carry it differently. That night she sat on the porch alone, watching the stars blink into view, and for the first time in years, she whispered, "Thank you, Mum," knowing now how much had been given, how much had been endured, and how much love had survived the silence. Their life, once fractured, now became something whole, not perfect, not free of shadows, but filled with enough light to keep walking forward. Leah got a job at the community center, helping teens who reminded her of herself, angry, lost, searching for something they couldn't name. And in helping them, she found pieces of herself returning. Her father joined a local garden club, of all things, growing tomatoes and peppers and laughing over soil, like it was sacred. And maybe it was, in the way it reminded him that life always finds a way to bloom again. They made traditions of their own, monthly memory dinners where they told stories of Eleanor, of their pain, of their joys, allowing the past to live beside them instead of behind them. Leah still had bad days, moments when the guilt tried to claw back in, but now she had tools, she had love, and most importantly, she had her father. And when people asked her about him, she no longer said, "We don't talk," but rather, "We're finding our way back." Because family isn't about perfection, it's about return, about choosing each other even when it's hard, even when it's late. And in that ongoing journey, Leah finally understood the price of a promise may be high, but the reward of love, reborn, is worth every moment of pain it took to get there. Leah sat by the window of her room, the sun tracing shadows across her floor like time moving in quiet whispers. And all she could think about was how everything had changed, and yet somehow stayed painfully familiar. Her father was downstairs, humming an old tune as he prepared lunch. And for once, the sound didn't make her tense up. It felt like home. Tentative but warm, she reached for the envelope she hadn't dared to open for weeks. Eleanor's final letter, written by her father's hand, but dictated in the last conscious moments before her final decline. It was wrinkled now, creased, from being held too long, and read too many times without ever truly being read. But Leah knew today was the day she had to face it. Her heart beat faster as she pulled the paper out, her fingers trembling like the truth inside was too heavy to hold without breaking. The words were simple, almost childlike in their clarity, but they carved into her soul like stone. "Tell Leah I've always known she'd come back. Tell her I forgive her for not understanding sooner." That was the moment Leah realized forgiveness wasn't a right. It was a gift she had been given by someone she barely knew, and it was now hers to carry forward. Later that evening, her father told her about the promise he'd made to Eleanor, the one that had shaped everything, that had kept him in town, kept him struggling, kept him alone. It wasn't just about caretaking, it was about never remarrying, never moving on, never letting another woman take the place Eleanor had once filled, even after she slipped into the silence of her illness. Leah's heart twisted, realizing now why he had turned down so many invitations, so many second chances, so many friends. He had sacrificed his own joy to honor the memory of someone he couldn't let go. And in honoring that promise, he had unknowingly kept himself closed off from Leah too, shutting down emotionally, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to love two people fully, while grieving someone who never truly left. The weight of that sacrifice crushed her in a way no lecture ever could, because for the first time she understood the cost of loyalty without balance. She wanted to be angry, to call it selfish, but instead she wept, realizing how deeply human it was to confuse love with self-denial. In that moment, she didn't just forgive her father, she honored him by promising herself that she would not live a life rooted in emotional silence. The next morning, she brought it up gently, asking him what he would do now that the promise no longer needed to be kept. Her voice barely more than a whisper, as if saying it too loudly would break the spell of peace they'd finally found. He looked at her, his eyes worn from decades of waiting, and he said, "I don't know how to be anyone other than the man who waited." That confession broke something open between them, an invisible wall neither had dared to touch, one built not from resentment, but from the fear that healing meant letting go of the ones they'd loved most. Leah reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, and said, "Maybe you don't have to let go. Maybe you just have to let others in." He didn't respond, not immediately, but his eyes glistened with something new, possibility, maybe, or permission to begin again. It was the first time Leah saw him as more than just her father or a caregiver. It was the first time she saw him as a man still capable of living, and in that delicate space between endings and beginnings, something tender passed between them, unspoken but understood. It's never too late to begin again, even if the past still echoes loudly in your heart. Days turned into weeks, and their lives took on new shapes. Small shifts at first, like movie nights, unplanned road trips, and lazy Sunday mornings with mismatched socks and takeout food. They started visiting Eleanor's grave together, not out of mourning, but as a ritual of gratitude, an acknowledgement that her life had shaped theirs, and her silence had brought them back to each other. Leah brought flowers each time, not the perfect kind, but wild ones she picked from their backyard or roadside, because they reminded her of the beauty in imperfection. Her father, once a stoic shadow in the house, began laughing more often, sometimes too loud, sometimes awkwardly, but always genuinely, and it warmed every cold memory Leah had tucked away in her teenage anger. They didn't pretend everything was fixed, because some things, some regrets, never fully disappear, but they learned to live above the ache, rather than inside it. And Leah, who once swore she'd never call that house home again, now found herself humming in the hallway, caught off guard by how natural it felt to belong again. Healing, she realized, wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was the quiet re-entry into life, one soft moment at a time. There was no grand apology, no cinematic confession, but there was honesty, and somehow that felt more healing than the words she had once begged for, in her mind. Leah realized that both of them had been waiting for something from the other that neither had been brave enough to give until now. He wasn't good at saying sorry, because he had spent a lifetime proving love through sacrifice, and she hadn't apologized either because she had been too hurt to see beyond her pain. But now, with everything laid bare between them, the letters, the pawn slips, the silence, they didn't need perfect words, just true ones. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, whispering, "Let's stop waiting for the right words and just keep choosing each other." He nodded, and for the first time she saw his walls crumble, not from weakness, but from trust, like a fortress finally ready to let someone in. The apology may never come the way she imagined, but love had its own language, and that night it spoke loudly in quiet gestures, shared food, and tired eyes that finally met with no armor in between. And sometimes that was enough. But life, as it always does, had one more twist waiting in the shadows, a quiet truth neither of them saw coming, one that would test whether their fragile reconciliation could survive something far deeper than pride. The next morning, as Leah gathered laundry and cleaned out a drawer she had avoided since childhood, she found a letter addressed to someone she had never heard of, someone named Eleanor. The envelope was old, faded, its edges worn like it had been opened and sealed many times, and curiosity burned in her hands as she carefully unfolded the note. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, but the words weren't meant for her, and what they revealed shook the foundation of everything she thought she knew about their broken family. It wasn't just her mother who left, it was her mother who gave him an ultimatum, one that changed everything, one he had never spoken about. As she read, her heart pounded harder with each sentence, and for the first time, she realized that what she knew of their story was only half the truth. And now, that missing half threatened to unravel everything they had just begun to rebuild. Leah didn't think much of it when the doorbell rang that cloudy afternoon, but something in her chest stirred with unease as she walked toward the sound. She opened the door to see a familiar face from a life she'd worked hard to leave behind. Her mother's sister, Aunt Diane, standing with hesitant eyes and a nervous smile. It had been years since anyone from that side of the family reached out, their silence thick with judgment and abandonment after Leah's mother walked out on them both. Leah had grown used to pretending they never existed, walling off the hurt and replacing it with cold indifference she wore like armor. But seeing Aunt Diane now, older and softer than she remembered, cracked something inside her that she hadn't realized was still fragile. "Can I come in?" the older woman asked gently, holding a manila envelope like it weighed more than it should. And though her instinct screamed to shut the door and walk away, Leah stepped aside, because some answers come only when we choose to stop running. They sat at the kitchen table, where Leah had once eaten in silence during the worst months of her father's illness. And now here she was, face to face with the woman who had vanished like a ghost from her past. "Your father doesn't know I'm here," Aunt Diane began, her voice trembling as she looked around the house that still held echoes of her sister. "I wanted to talk to you before I lost my nerve," she continued, sliding the envelope toward Leah with hands that looked worn from time and regret. Leah said nothing, her jaw tight, heart thudding in her chest, unsure if this was a confrontation or a confession. Aunt Diane's eyes welled with tears as she whispered, "Your mother left more behind than you think," and with that, she pushed the envelope further across the table. Inside were letters, handwritten, yellowed at the edges, with Leah's name written on the front of every envelope in her mother's elegant script. And just like that, the anger she thought was long buried surged forward, clashing with curiosity, confusion, and something deeper hope. Leah stared at the pile, her throat dry, unsure if she wanted to read the words or burn them before they could reopen old wounds. "Why are you giving me these now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, eyes still locked on the painful stack of secrets. Aunt Diane took a shaky breath and said, "Because I was wrong to keep them from you. I was angry too. But I see now how much you deserved the truth." Her words didn't fix anything, but they cracked the ice Leah had carefully preserved around her heart for years, and she hated how much part of her needed to hear them. She reached for the first letter, her fingers trembling as she opened it, revealing her mother's familiar handwriting and a date from over a decade ago. The words inside didn't erase the pain, but they painted a picture Leah had never seen. A scared, broken woman battling demons of her own and begging for forgiveness she didn't know how to ask for in person. And as Leah read in silence, tears fell freely, not from pity but from a strange mix of sorrow and the unbearable realization that maybe her mother hadn't truly abandoned her after all. The letters told a story Leah had never heard, of a woman unraveling under the weight of depression, addiction, and guilt so thick it strangled every attempt to return home. Her mother had failed, tried again, and failed worse. Each letter laced with remorse, love, and the haunting refrain of "I never stopped thinking of you." Leah sobbed through pages that described how her mother watched from afar, sending gifts that were never delivered, showing up to recitals she was too afraid to approach. The betrayal still stung, but now it was shaded with a complexity that turned hate into heartbreak and blame into a fragile kind of understanding. Aunt Diane explained how she thought she was protecting Leah by hiding the letters, believing a clean break would be easier than unanswered pain. But now she knew better, because sometimes the truth hurts less than the silence that replaces it. Leah closed the last letter with trembling hands, her heart heavier but somehow lighter all at once, filled with memories that never happened but still shaped her. And in the quiet aftermath, she whispered, I didn't know she tried." Later that evening, Leah sat outside with her father, the letters clutched tightly to her chest, unsure how to even begin the conversation. She told him everything about Aunt Diane's visit, the hidden letters, and the truth she never knew she needed. Her father's eyes darkened with emotion, a storm of grief and anger flashing behind them, but he said nothing at first, just stared at the ground with his jaw clenched. "I hated her for what she did to you," he finally said, voice low and cracked. "But maybe I hated her because I didn't know how to forgive myself either." Leah leaned against his shoulder, both of them carrying scars from the same wound, but finally speaking the truth about it. "I think she wanted us to know she never stopped loving us," Leah whispered, and for once her father didn't argue. They sat in silence for a long time, letting grief become a thread that didn't divide but connected, stitching them together through shared pain, shared history, and a new kind of honesty. It was imperfect and unfinished, but it was theirs, and that mattered more than any letter ever could. In the days that followed, Leah started writing back, not to her mother, but to the parts of herself that had gone unheard for too long. She filled pages with memories, apologies, and affirmations, not to dwell on the past, but to rewrite the story she told herself about who she was. She wrote about the shame she carried, the fear she buried, and the pride that kept her silent, even when she longed to be held. Her letters became a form of healing, a conversation with the little girl inside her who once waited at the window for a mother who never came. And slowly, she stopped waiting and started living, accepting that the past couldn't change, but the future still waited with open arms. She forgave herself, not because she was blameless, but because carrying the weight of abandonment was never meant to be her burden. And in that release, she discovered something powerful. The act of forgiveness is rarely for the person who hurt you. It's the key that unlocks your own freedom. The apology she never expected didn't come in one grand moment. It came in fragments through letters, conversations, and moments of truth she didn't think she'd ever face. It came through the shaky words of a relative who finally admitted to being wrong, and the quiet strength of a father who faced the truth alongside her. It came in the stillness of her own heart, when she stopped blaming the world and started letting herself heal. Leah realized that life never gave her the family she dreamed of, but it gave her the chance to rebuild one from the ashes of what remained. And with each sunrise, she stepped further into that choice, choosing love, choosing presence, choosing to break the cycle that once broke her. Because sometimes the most powerful apologies are the ones that don't beg for forgiveness, but open the door for new beginnings. And Leah, wounded, wiser, and finally free, stepped through that door without looking back. She printed one of her mother's letters and placed it in a frame, not as a tribute to the woman who left, but as a reminder that even broken people can leave behind something beautiful. It sat on her dresser next to a photo of her and her dad, laughing on the day he finished his last round of treatment, a snapshot of a new chapter that almost never happened. Visitors often asked about the letter in the frame, and she would simply smile and say, "It's part of the story." She didn't need to explain the pain or the path, because what mattered most was that she chose to learn, to stay, and to love. Leah finally understood that healing isn't the absence of wounds, it's the courage to live with them and still keep going. The apology she never expected changed her life, not because it fixed everything, but because it allowed her to see what was worth fighting for, and in the end, that was enough. Leah thought she'd left the worst behind her, with the letters read, the truth spoken, and the wounds finally given space to breathe. But peace has a way of being temporary, when life still holds unresolved storms. It was a rainy Thursday when her father collapsed again, this time without warning, as if the universe had decided to see how much more her heart could take. She screamed his name as she held him in the hallway, his face pale, his breathing shallow, and the sound of the ambulance siren in the distance felt like déjà vu clawing its way back. The hospital lights buzzed overhead just like they had before, cold and unforgiving, and Leah sat in the waiting room with fists clenched, praying the storm wouldn't take him away. Every second dragged like a cruel punishment. The walls too white, the nurses too quiet, and the memories too loud inside her spinning head. She hated that she had finally opened her heart again, only to have fear yank it from her chest in one merciless swoop. And as she stared at the swinging doors of the emergency room, she whispered, "Please, not again, not now." The doctor's face was calm, too calm, which made Leah's pulse hammer louder in her ears as she stood to meet the news she couldn't yet name. "It's his heart," the doctor explained, gentle but direct, "and we caught it early, but he'll need surgery soon." The words didn't land the way they should. They hovered in the air like unfinished prayers, their meaning held hostage by Leah's exhausted disbelief. She nodded, even though she didn't understand, too numb to feel, too scared to cry, just trapped in a silence that swallowed everything. Her father, who had become her rock, her mirror, her anchor in the chaos, was once again hanging in the balance between life and something unthinkable. She walked into his hospital room where machines beat steadily and wires clung to his arms like questions she couldn't answer, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to speak. Then he looked at her with a weak smile and whispered, "Still here," and that was all it took for the tears to fall like rain. Leah sat by his side for days, barely eating, barely sleeping, reading his favorite books aloud just to hear something other than the sterile hum of medical equipment. She rubbed his hand when he winced in pain, whispered memories into his ear, and prayed like she hadn't prayed in years, bargaining with a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Every nurse knew her name, every hallway felt familiar, and every night she watched the shadows in the room grow longer and colder. She thought about how far they had come, how much had changed between them, and how fragile it all still was. The fear of losing him again wrapped itself around her chest like a vine, choking her slowly as she tried to hold everything together. He'd fought so hard to live for her, to forgive, to love again, and now life was testing whether it had all been enough. And Leah realized that love, true love, is not just what we say. It's how we show up when the storm comes back. On the fifth night, her father turned to her, his voice raspy, and said, "I don't want you to put your life on hold for me again." And it shattered her. She wanted to yell, to shake him, to beg him to stop talking like a man ready to leave. But instead, she just gripped his hand tighter. "You are my life," she whispered, voice cracking, and he closed his eyes as if that truth was too heavy to carry. He told her stories she had never heard before, about her childhood, about her mother, about the nights he stayed up wondering if he was enough. Leah listened with tears streaming down her face, realizing that even now he was trying to make her strong enough to let go if she had to. But she wasn't ready. Not now. Not when they had come so far and healed so much. And even though part of her knew this was out of her control, she silently vowed that she would fight for him, for them, no matter what. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, and every day leading up to it felt like walking through water, slow and suffocating. Leah stayed strong on the outside, smiling for him, cracking jokes, pretending the future wasn't looming like a shadow over them. But at night, when she went home to shower and rest, she collapsed into her bed and cried like she was 15 again, all alone, angry at the world for threatening to take away the one person she couldn't lose. She found herself writing him letters, just in case, pouring her heart onto paper with words she wasn't brave enough to say aloud. She wrote about how he taught her what resilience looked like, how he gave her permission to love again, and how every part of her was shaped by his sacrifice. She wrote about the mistakes, the regrets, and the gratitude that came too late, but still meant everything. And when she finished, she tucked the letters into his overnight bag, not out of fear, but because sometimes love needs to be written just in case it's never spoken again. The night before the surgery, Leah curled up next to her father in the hospital bed, the nurses turning a blind eye, understanding the unspoken weight of what they were both carrying. He stroked her hair like he used to when she was small, and she held on to him like a child afraid of the dark. They talked about everything and nothing. Favorite songs, dumb memories, the time he burned dinner and tried to cover it up with cereal, laughter mixed with tears, fear with love. And in that moment, they weren't father and daughter fighting for one more day. They were just two people who had found their way back to each other. Whatever happens tomorrow, he whispered, I'm proud of you, Leah. And that broke her in a way that only love ever could. She kissed his forehead, her heart aching with both hope and dread, and promised him she'd be there always, no matter what. And as the machines beeped on into the night, Leah closed her eyes and prayed for one more chance. The morning of the surgery came with grey skies and heavy silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Leah walked beside the gurney as they wheeled him toward the operating room, her hand never leaving his, her voice whispering words of comfort. She didn't fully believe. I'll be right here, she said over and over, like a mantra, like a promise, like a lifeline. He gave her one last smile before the doors closed between them, and the stillness that followed was the loudest thing Leah had ever heard. She sat in the waiting room, fingers laced tight in prayer, heart pounding in every corner of her body, surrounded by strangers who all looked like they were breaking too. Time warped, minutes felt like hours, and every second that passed without news felt like a cruel test of her strength. And still she waited because love waits, even when it's terrified. She didn't look up when the nurse finally entered the waiting room, afraid that a single glance would shatter whatever hope she had left clinging to her chest like a fragile thread. But the nurse smiled gently and said, he made it through, and the world shifted from grey to colour in an instant so surreal it almost felt like a dream. Leah gasped, covering her mouth with shaking hands, relief washing over her like a tide that crashed through her body and stole the air from her lungs. The nurse explained that it would be a long recovery, that he would need patience and rest. But all Leah could hear was that one line, he made it through. She stood there in disbelief, eyes welling with grateful tears, because for the first time in a long time, life had given her a second chance instead of taking one away. Her knees buckled as she sat down slowly, her chest rising and falling with sobs that felt like praise in disguise. And in that moment, Leah knew that storms would always come. But love, real, deep, sacrificial love, was what anchored you through them. When she saw him after surgery, weak and pale but smiling, it felt like witnessing a miracle wearing a hospital gown and a fading heartbeat. Told you I'd come back, he whispered hoarsely, and Leah laughed through her tears, holding his hand like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. She didn't know how long they'd have together, didn't know what battles still lay ahead, but for now he was here, and that was enough. They sat in silence sometimes, no need for words, because pain had already said everything that mattered, and healing was now the quiet work they shared. She fed him soup when he was too weak to lift a spoon, rubbed his back when the coughs came, and read his favorite poems until he drifted into sleep. These small acts, once burdens in her teenage mind, had now become sacred rituals, a way of saying I love you without needing to say it aloud. And every night, before she left the room, she whispered, thank you for staying, knowing that gratitude is the language of those who've learned what it means to lose. Her friends didn't understand why she had disappeared from parties, from chats, from the fun she used to chase like it held meaning. But Leah had changed in ways she couldn't explain in text messages. She didn't mind missing out on fleeting things anymore because she had found something eternal in the way her father smiled now, in the way his hand found hers, even in sleep. The world outside moved on, oblivious, but Leah had stepped into a quieter, deeper story, one stitched together by pain and softened by forgiveness. She realized that rebellion wasn't just a phase, it had been a mask for her wounds, a scream for attention that only love could quiet. And now, caring for her father didn't feel like punishment, it felt like purpose, like a way to repay a debt she could never measure. She didn't know who she was becoming, but she liked her more than she liked the girl who once ran away from everything that hurt. And maybe this was what growing up truly meant, learning that love doesn't avoid the fire, it walks through it, hand in hand with the one who matters most. One evening, weeks into his recovery, her father turned to her with tired eyes that still held the weight of years and whispered, "You saved me." Leah shook her head, brushing a tear from her cheek, and replied, "No, you saved me first." That moment passed between them like a silent promise, binding them tighter than blood ever could. Because now they were survivors of the same war. They had walked through abandonment, through anger, through silence and sickness, and somehow emerged with something more tender than either had imagined. Leah couldn't change the years she had wasted, couldn't undo the pain she had caused, but she could love harder now, and that was enough. In the stillness of that night, she realized that life teaches in whispers and storms, and both had changed her into someone her father could be proud of. And for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she could be proud of herself too. She found herself waking up earlier than usual, not out of obligation, but because something in her heart felt called to be near him before the world intruded again with its noise. Every morning she would sit beside his bed, coffee in hand, listening to the sounds of machines and birds outside the window, thinking about all the mornings she used to miss, while choosing to disappear. She realized now that healing wasn't loud or glamorous. It was the quiet consistency of presence, the daily return to love even after it had been strained and tested. Her father no longer looked like the man who once stood tall and unshaken. Now he looked more like a man remade by survival, his fragility shining brighter than his strength. But to Leah, he had never looked more human, more valuable, more deserving of her time, even in his weakness. She wished she had understood this before life forced it into her hands. But maybe that's how wisdom works. It rarely arrives when we're ready. And as she watched the sun stretch across his worn face, she knew this was what she had been running from all along: vulnerability, responsibility, and the ache of love. One afternoon, while going through the old boxes in his closet, she found a small notebook she had never seen before, its pages worn and stained with age and emotion. Inside were handwritten letters, unsent, raw, unfinished, written to her during the years she had been gone. Every line dripping with longing, confusion, and a desperate hope that she would come back. Some were angry, others were full of apologies, but all of them had one common thread. He never stopped loving her, not for a single day. Leah read them in silence, her breath catching with every word that mirrored the regret now living in her own heart, the guilt sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. In those pages she didn't just see a father, she saw a man who had failed, begged, prayed, and waited for his daughter to love him again. She clutched the notebook like a lifeline, tears soaking the ink that once held the weight of his silence, and whispered a broken "I'm sorry" to the air. And though he wasn't in the room to hear it, she felt something release inside her, like the first true moment of forgiveness for both of them. That evening, when she brought him the notebook and placed it in his hands, his eyes widened with quiet recognition, and his voice trembled as he said, "You weren't supposed to see these," but Leah only smiled through her tears and said, "I needed to, because some truths have to be faced before healing can finish its work." They read through the letters together, both pausing, laughing, crying, remembering the worst and best of who they had been. The room became a sanctuary of grace, filled not with accusations, but with acceptance, not with shame, but with understanding. It was the kind of moment movies try to capture, but always miss. The kind where silence says everything, and love sits in the room like a ghost. Finally acknowledged, Leah realized that his pain had always mirrored hers, just in a different language, and that both of them had been waiting for each other to say the words neither had dared to say. And that night, when she tucked him into bed, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere again," meaning every syllable with the force of everything they had lived through. In the following days, her father started gaining strength, not just physically, but emotionally too, as if her presence was the medicine he never got from pills and procedures. He started walking again, slowly and with effort, leaning on her when he had to, but more often smiling with that stubborn pride that once pushed her away. They cooked together in the kitchen, where silence used to live, laughed over burnt toast, and sat outside watching stars instead of screens. There was something sacred about doing normal things again, something she had never appreciated when they had everything and didn't know what they stood to lose. Sometimes they talked about her childhood, the mistakes, the fights, the nights she didn't come home, and he never once used those memories to punish her, only to remind her how far they had come. She had once thought forgiveness was a moment, a word, a tear, but now she saw it was a lifestyle, a decision you make every day when the past tries to crawl back in. And with each sunrise, she chose again, not just to love her father, but to step. One rainy Sunday, Leah took him to church, the place she used to scoff at, rebel against and avoid like it held judgment instead of grace. He had asked once before when she was younger, and she had laughed in his face, calling it a waste of time and refusing to believe in anything she couldn't touch. But now she felt something shift as she helped him up the steps and into the pews, his frail hands gripping hers tightly like they were walking into something sacred together. The preacher spoke about prodigals and mercy, about how home never stops waiting even when love gets lost. And Leah cried harder than she had in months. Her father didn't say much, but his silence said everything. She knew in her bones he had prayed for this moment 1,000 times and never stopped believing it would come. It wasn't religion she found that day, but redemption, the kind that doesn't erase your mistakes, but turns them into something beautiful and honest. And as they walked out into the storm, soaked and smiling, she felt like something inside her had finally come clean too. That night, her journal held only one sentence: "Today, I came home for real." In the weeks that followed, Leah found herself falling into a rhythm she never imagined she would love. The kind of rhythm that came from caregiving and companionship, not chaos or rebellion. She began to understand that time was not the enemy she once fought against, but a fragile gift that could be either wasted or cherished. Her friends called less. Her old life grew quiet, but she didn't mind, because every hour spent with her father felt like reclaiming something that should have never been lost. They started making plans together, small ones like planting flowers in the garden or finding recipes from her mother's old book. And each plan was a thread sewn into the fabric of their second chance. She learned to listen better, to ask questions she used to avoid, to laugh without bitterness and cry without shame. Every time her father smiled at her now, she saw more than approval. She saw a man who had suffered long enough to know what truly mattered. And in those moments, Leah understood that redemption wasn't loud or sudden. It was steady, patient, and always waiting for your yes. But life, as it often does, had one more test waiting in the shadows, one that would demand everything she had just begun to rebuild. It started with a phone call on a cold Thursday morning. His test results were back, and the cancer had returned with aggressive force, this time in his liver. Leah sat frozen at the kitchen table as the doctor's words echoed like thunder in a glass room. and all the strength she had built suddenly trembled beneath the weight of this new storm. She looked at her father across the room, still sipping his tea, unaware of the news that would change everything again, and her heart broke not for herself, but for him. This time it wasn't about second chances. It was about how much love you could pour into someone when the clock was loud and merciless. She waited until dinner to tell him, her voice soft but unwavering, and watched his eyes go distant for a moment before he nodded slowly, like he had already known. He didn't cry, didn't panic. He just reached for her hand and said, "Then let's make the most of what we have left." From that day forward, every moment felt brighter and heavier all at once, like joy and grief had chosen to walk beside them at the same time. They started making a list, not a bucket list, but a gratitude list of all the things they had shared since the beginning of her return. And the list grew longer every night. Leah documented everything, the laughs during old movie nights, the quiet walks to the park bench, the stories he told that she never knew as a child. He began writing letters again, but this time they were for her future. Words she would one day read when he was no longer there to speak them out loud. And though the weight of the inevitable pressed hard against her chest, she made a decision not to live in mourning while he was still breathing. They danced in the kitchen, took short road trips to nowhere, and listened to old songs with the volume up and the windows down. It was a strange kind of peace, knowing the end was near, but choosing to fill every space with as much love as possible. One morning, while watching the sunrise from the porch, he looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "You were worth the wait." And Leah felt her soul split wide open. All the years she had wasted, all the nights she didn't come home, all the cruel things she'd said, they still haunted her sometimes, but he never held them against her. He chose to see the woman she had become, not the girl who had run away, and that forgiveness became the anchor she clung to. Leah kissed his hand and whispered, "Thank you for still loving me when I didn't deserve it." And he smiled and said, "That's what love is. It doesn't keep score. It just keeps showing up." She realized then that love wasn't something you earned. It was something you returned to again and again, no matter how far you drifted. It was messy, painful, imperfect, but holy in its persistence. And now she saw why he had never stopped fighting for her. And even though she feared the day she would lose him, she promised herself she wouldn't waste a second more looking backward. As his health declined rapidly, Leah became both daughter and nurse, learning how to administer medicine, soothe his pain, and hold him through long, restless nights. It was in those quiet hours that they spoke most honestly about life and death, about heaven and memory, about regrets and gratitude. He told her things he had never shared with anyone else, his fears, his failures, his dreams for her, and she listened like every word was sacred scripture. Sometimes he was lucid, sometimes confused, but always gentle, always kind, even when the pain became unbearable. Leah would sing to him softly when the nights grew cold, not because she had a great voice, but because she knew it comforted him, and through the exhaustion and the heartbreak, she found a strength in herself she never thought existed, the kind of strength born from love, not pride. She wasn't just making up for the past anymore. She was living fully in the present, giving him everything he had once given her, even when she didn't know how to receive it. The hospice nurse once pulled her aside and said, "He's holding on for you," and Leah nodded, tears filling her eyes because she already knew. He was waiting for something, not permission to go, but assurance that she would be okay, that she wouldn't run from the world again once he was gone. So one night, as he lay quietly with labored breath, she leaned close and whispered, "You gave me everything, and I'll be all right now, Daddy." He opened his eyes for a moment, smiled with all the strength he had left, and whispered back, "Then I can rest." That night he passed away peacefully in his sleep, with her hand in his, the same way she had promised to stay until the end. There was no drama, no flashing lights, just the final breath of a man who had loved deeply and been loved in return. And as she sat in the quiet afterward, Leah cried, not from guilt, not from fear, but from the beautiful ache of having known such love at all. After the funeral, the house felt louder in its silence than it ever did when filled with arguments or footsteps, and Leah found herself standing in the middle of the living room, afraid to sit down because it meant accepting he was gone. Every object around her, the mug he used, the worn-out recliner, the framed photo of her as a child on his desk, felt like a relic of a world that had quietly shut its door. She wandered from room to room, searching for pieces of him not just to remember, but to hold on to, even if just for a moment longer. It was then that she discovered a small wooden box tucked beneath his bed, filled with letters he'd written but never sent, addressed to her during the years she was away. Each one carried pain, hope, forgiveness and love, written in his careful, patient handwriting, as if he believed she would come back someday to read them. She sat on the floor for hours, reading every word with trembling fingers and swollen eyes, whispering apologies between sobs that came from the deepest part of her soul. In that moment, Leah realized that while death had taken her father's body, it hadn't taken his voice, his presence, or the love he had quietly protected for her in every line he wrote. The weeks turned to months, and the ache in Leah's heart didn't disappear, but it softened into something quieter, an echo rather than a scream, a warmth rather than a wound. She kept the letters close, read them on hard days, and used them as her compass when she felt lost again, because his words had a way of reminding her who she truly was. She started visiting the hospital where he had once stayed, volunteering in the oncology ward, and telling small stories about hope, love, and forgiveness to people who needed it. Her story, his story, became more than just a private tragedy. It became a reason to serve, a reason to connect, and a reason to carry his memory into other people's healing. Some patients smiled when she spoke, others cried, and some just listened silently. But Leah knew she was planting something valuable each time she showed up. She had once run from the pain, but now she walked into it with purpose, knowing that love sometimes asks you to break open, so others can find healing in your scars. And in that choice, she discovered a strange and beautiful truth, that even loss can become a gift when it leads you back to love. One rainy afternoon, while packing away some of her father's belongings, Leah found a key inside a small envelope labeled "For Leah, when she's ready," and her heart skipped a beat as she held it tightly in her hand. The key led to a drawer in his desk, and inside it she found an old journal, his journal filled with entries from the very day she left home as a teenager. Each page chronicled not just his sadness, but his growth, his fears, his moments of doubt and pride as he watched her from afar. Always hoping, always loving. He wrote about her first YouTube video, about the time he saw her in a cafe but didn't approach because she looked too angry to speak to, and even about the day she finally came back and knocked on his door. Through those pages, she saw the quiet man she never really understood, a father who wasn't perfect, but who loved her with every broken piece of himself. She closed the journal slowly, kissed the cover, and whispered, "I see you now, Dad." And in that moment, something in her heart finally fully healed. It wasn't just closure, it was connection, the final bridge between who she was, who he had been, and who she was becoming. On the anniversary of his passing, Leah didn't light a candle or post a dramatic tribute online. She simply visited his favorite park bench and sat there with a thermos of tea. The way he used to, she didn't cry this time. Instead, she smiled quietly at the sky, feeling like he was sitting beside her in the breeze, in the light, in the peace of the moment. A little boy and his father passed by laughing about something silly, and she watched them, realizing how much beauty there was in ordinary love, in moments that don't seem significant, until they're gone. Leah remembered all the times she'd rolled her eyes at his jokes, all the times she'd slammed the door, and yet how he had always left it unlocked. She breathed deeply, grateful that life had given her one more chance to come home, to make things right, to become the kind of daughter she now hoped he had always dreamed of. As she stood to leave, she whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me," and walked away not as a girl full of regret, but as a woman full of grace. And in every step she took after that, she carried the lesson he left her, that love doesn't run out, even when time does. Leah stood in front of a small group of high school students, her palms trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to share. Her story. She looked at the sea of young, restless faces, some defiant like she once was, others silently curious, all unaware of how one decision could shape or shatter a lifetime. She took a breath, looked up at the flickering ceiling light, and began to speak, not as a polished speaker, but as a daughter who had learned too late, and yet just in time. With every word, she peeled back the layers of rebellion, anger, pride, and regret that had once wrapped tightly around her heart like chains. She told them about the man she abandoned, the mistakes she made, and the second chance she almost didn't take, until life forced her hand. And as she spoke of love lost and love rediscovered, a hush fell over the room like snowfall on rooftops, quiet, still, and heavy with meaning. In their eyes, she saw not pity, but reflection, and that was the beginning of something new. After the talk, a boy who reminded her of herself at 16, wounded, guarded, and angry, approached her with hesitant steps, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He didn't say much, but he looked her in the eye and simply muttered, "Thanks," before walking away. And in that single word, Leah felt a ripple of purpose travel through her. She realized then that her father's greatest gift to her wasn't just love or forgiveness. It was the chance to transform her pain into power, to turn a personal heartbreak into a lantern for others lost in the same dark. She started speaking more, visiting schools, creating videos, not to become famous, but to be the voice she once needed to hear when she was too stubborn to listen. Each story she told, each soul she touched, was a quiet redemption, not just for her, but for the girl she used to be, and the father who never stopped believing in her. She had thought losing him would break her, but it had instead built her into something stronger, something gentler. In carrying his story, she had finally found her own. At night, when the world felt quieter, she often sat by the window with a mug of tea, just like he used to, and let herself talk to him in the stillness, like he never left. Sometimes she laughed at old memories, like the time he tried to cook dinner and nearly burned the kitchen down, or the way he used to sing off-key in the car just to make her groan. Other times she wept, not with bitterness, but with the tender ache of gratitude for the time they were able to reclaim. In the silence, she would whisper things she never had the chance to say. "I see now, Dad. I understand why you worked so hard, why you said no so often, why you never gave up on me." And though there was no voice to answer, she could almost feel him smiling in the air around her, like sunlight through a dusty window. It wasn't grief anymore. It was memory. It was presence. It was peace. And that peace became her comfort. On one particularly cold evening, Leah received a letter in the mail from the hospital her father had stayed in, inviting her to speak at their annual remembrance event for families and caregivers. At first, she hesitated, unsure if her heart could handle walking those halls again, unsure if she could relive those moments so publicly. But then she remembered how bravely her father had faced every appointment, every symptom, every quiet goodbye disguised as a "see you tomorrow," and she knew what she had to do. She wore his old watch on her wrist that day, like a shield, like a reminder of how far she'd come and how much further she had to go. Standing at the podium, She didn't read from a paper, she spoke from her heart, her voice shaking but strong, her truth raw but radiant. She ended with these words: "I ran when my father got sick, but love didn't stop running after me." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was soft, respectful, soaked in tears, and filled with understanding. That night, after the event, she sat outside on a bench beneath the stars, thinking about how much of life is wasted on the things we don't say until it's too late. But her story had changed her, had made her bolder, softer, more present, and she promised herself to never again let pride speak louder than love. She took out her phone, opened a blank note, and started writing small messages to people she had once drifted from. Friends, family, even a teacher she once resented. She wrote, "Thank you, I'm sorry, I miss you, and I love you." And though some would never reply, the act itself felt like breaking free from old shackles. That night she slept deeply, dreaming not of the past, but of the future. A future where healing didn't wait for tragedy, and love didn't wait to be proven. Her father's final gift wasn't just forgiveness, it was legacy, a ripple of restoration that began in silence and grew into a wave of hope. And Leah was determined to ride that wave into every corner of her life. Years passed, and Leah became a mentor to many, not by giving perfect advice, but by showing up with honesty, vulnerability, and the kind of wisdom only earned through fire. Her story was shared in classrooms, podcasts, documentaries, and workshops, each retelling like a seed planted in someone else's hardened heart. But she never let herself forget the beginning, the pain, the shame, and the night she came home to find her father, barely able to hold her hand. It was that memory that grounded her, humbled her, reminded her that second chances are sacred and never guaranteed. She often said, "I had to lose my father to find the kind of daughter I was meant to be." And every time, the room would fall silent in awe of the truth behind her words. People began to thank her not just for her voice, but for her courage to bleed in front of them, to turn sorrow into a map back to love. And in that gratitude, she felt her father's presence again, living through the lives she touched. One sunny afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood where she once slammed doors and shouted curses, she passed a young girl yelling at her father on their porch. The scene struck her like a flashback, and without thinking she paused, smiled softly at the father and said, "She'll come around. Don't give up." The father looked startled, but nodded, and the girl looked confused, but Leah just kept walking, knowing that those words were once spoken over her too. It was in those moments that Leah understood the full circle of her journey, that pain was never meant to imprison us, but to prepare us to lift someone else. And though her father was no longer beside her, she saw him in every act of grace she gave, in every story she told, in every hand she reached for. Life had indeed taught her a lesson, one written not in textbooks or tweets, but in love, in loss, in late goodbyes and early forgiveness. And with every step she took now, she carried not only her father's memory, but his quiet, unwavering faith in the girl who once ran away. Because even when we think we're too late, love has a way of finding us right on time.